everyone, my name is Amy, and on behalf of the Academic Writing Education Center, I welcome you to Reading to Connect. In our Week 12 class, today we're going to be talking about to mitigate or to adapt, act on climate change. This week we'll be looking at different articles about climate change and we'll see what your perception could be. Let's go. So when we talk about climate change, we'll think this is an old topic and we've known everything about it already. However, this week we want to focus on your perception of climate change and we want to see climate change from different perspectives. How can we analyze this particular topic and how can we better face the crisis of climate change as it is quite imminent? So in today's lesson, the first goal we're trying to complete is to look at different articles regarding climate change, and we're going to identify the issue in it related to climate change. Next, we're going to use our prior knowledge on the concept of climate change, and then we're going to distinguish facts from opinions. Next, we're going to identify the main idea of a text. Next, we're going to be looking at supporting detail that goes and argue for the main idea. Next, we're going to use our critical reading skills to gather facts from these articles and form our opinion on climate change. At last, we're going to try to synthesize the information we read and express our own opinion. So, before we begin, let's have a little bit of warm-up. In your personal opinion, what are some of the greatest threats to Earth? Is it man-made? Is it natural disasters? What are they? Write them down on a piece of paper, and we're going to come back. Perhaps you're thinking man-made disaster like nuclear war. Perhaps it's terrorism, cyber attack, fake news, or even global climate change. These are all very important issues, but today we're going to be focusing on climate change as it is happening and is affecting all of us on different levels on the aspects of our daily lives. According to a 26-country survey released by the Pew Research Center, climate change is seen as the biggest international threat facing many nations. In this particular study, it recorded the physical signs of climate change, for example, how heat has increased on land and in the ocean, and how the rise of sea levels as well as the melting of sea ice. This report also talked about the impact of climate change to the socio-economical development in a society, the health of human beings, how the displacement of human and non-human, as well as food safety and the entire chain organization, and the chain reaction on the biodiversity on land and within the ocean. Furthermore, in this report, it talked about that climate change is having a major effect on all aspects of the environment, as well as on the health and well-being of the global population. Essentially, the planet is way off track in dealing with climate change, and experts have declared that climate change is a far greater threat than the coronavirus. So what do you know about climate change? What do you want to find out about climate change? And what actions in regards to climate change have been taken so far? Write down your thoughts to these questions on a piece of paper. I'm going to come back and discuss. Now, before our discussion, let's look at a short clip about global climate in 2019. Having seen the clip, we're now going to try to identify facts from opinions. Number 1. Climate scientists and experts agree that fossil fuel consumption gave rise to global warming. Is this a fact or opinion? According to the video, this should be a fact. A lot of people might think since the word agreed appeared in the statement that it must be an opinion. However, we need to look at the overall statement to determine whether this is a fact or opinion that has been expressed in the video. Next. Rising sea level over the past century as a result of warmer oceans and melting glacier has made coastal storms more destructive. Is this an opinion or a fact? That is correct. It is a fact. It's also an observation to the environment. Next, if individuals do not take measurable actions to reduce fossil fuel consumptions and stop climate change, civilization may collapse. Is this a fact or opinion? It is an opinion. However, we do need to know that if this particular statement has sufficient reference or evidence to support it, it could also be a fact. Next, the worldwide boom in natural gas has created a possible solution to climate change because it has reduced reliance on coal, a far more damaging pollutant. Is this a fact or opinion? Yes, it is opinion. Next, climate change-driven extreme weather and related disasters can damage economics and intensify inequalities among social groups. These factors may increase risks of violent armed conflicts, such as war over water and food. Is this a fact or opinion? This is the opinion. Now, let's look at the next statement. Scientific experts can be wrong. Is this a fact or opinion? That is a fact. Because although the word wrong was contained in the statement, we're looking at the overall statement that it has made. Scientists are still human beings and they could make mistakes, and hence this particular statement will be a fact because despite the fact that they're experts, they could also be wrong. Now, let's look at the first reading. We're going to be looking at an article talking about the European public and their understanding on the impacts of climate change to the world. Spend a bit of time, read through it, and we're going to come back and discuss. Does the European public understand the impacts of climate change on the ocean? The first in-depth study of the European public's awareness of the impacts of climate change on the ocean shows that although most are relatively well informed, an alarming number remained uninformed and even misinformed. An opinion poll of 10,000 citizens in 10 European countries published in Frontier in Marine Science shows that many believe the Arctic sea ice is already completely lost during the summer and that sea temperatures have already risen by more than 2 degrees Celsius. A major shift in the way climate science is communicated to the public is needed to incentivize citizens to demand action to prevent the impacts of climate change. The oceans are our lifeline and the lungs of our planet, producing 70% of the oxygen we breathe. They regulate our climate and provide us with food, new medicines, and energy. However, the ocean, and therefore the future of humanity, is threatened by climate change. But how much does the public really understand the impacts of climate change, and what can be done to facilitate better communication between scientists, the media, government, NGOs, and the public? The opinion poll of 10,000 citizens is the first in-depth study looking at public engagement with marine climate change issues across 10 European countries. Although most of the European population is relatively informed about marine climate change issues, a surprising numbers are poorly informed and even misinformed, revealing a major failure at communicating climate change science to the public, explained Professor Carlos Lloret, co-author on the paper and director of the Red Sea Research Center in Saudi Arabia. 54% of European citizens believe that human plays only a partial role or no role in climate change. Many who thought that they were well informed on the impact of climate change on the ocean believe scenarios that may happen by 2100 if we do not reduce greenhouse gas emission have already occurred. For example, loss of Arctic sea ice in the summer. This accounts for 26% of respondents, and sea temperature increases of more than 2 degrees Celsius. This accounts for 30% of respondents. This is hugely disturbing because if these changes have already occurred in their minds, what incentive do these citizens have to demand actions to prevent such changes, says Lloret. The European public perceive ocean pollution as the most severe human impact on the ocean. However, they are not well informed on ocean acidification caused by carbon dioxide emissions, melting sea ice, coastal flooding, sea level rise, and extreme weather events were also of concern. Interestingly, nations that have already been coping with problems such as the Dutch with sea level rise and the Norwegians with sea ice loss are the least concerned with the impact of climate change. Citizens declare very little trust in government institutions and their scientists and have the most trust in scientists employed by university. Lead author Paul Buckley from the Center for Environment, Fishery, and Aquaculture Science in the United Kingdom explains. The study shows that we don't all engage with issues around climate change impacts on the coast and sea in the same way. Awareness and levels of concern are generally higher for people living closest to the sea, women, Southern Europeans, and increase with age. We need to tailor our message given the differences in how audiences across Europe engage with these issues. Making issues that seem remote from people's everyday life relevant is certainly a challenge. We are at a time when decisions made will have irreversible consequences, and this level of misinformation is a huge vulnerability for society in general and for future generations, says Durrett. The survey calls for a major shift in ways we communicate climate change with far less emphasis on what changes may occur in the future, as these can be misinterpreted by the public, and we need a greater involvement of university scientists. How's the reading? Now we're going to check your understanding about these particular reading. We're going to read each statement, and you are going to decide whether it's true or false according to the passage you just read. A. This passage reports the survey finding of European public perception of climate change impact. B. A large portion of European citizens are well informed on the impact of climate change on ocean acidification. C. According to the report, the average sea temperature has increased by more than 2 degrees Celsius. D. Making climate change issues more relevant to people's daily life across Europe is needed. Are these true or false? Now, for passage A and D, they are both true. And for passage B, it is actually false, perhaps a little confusing as well. Because in the third paragraph, it said that although most of the European population is relatively well informed about marine climate change issue, a surprising numbers are poorly informed and even misinformed. So by reading so, you would think that, oh, the European citizens are actually generally well informed of the issue. But if you read into B options carefully, you see that the subject that talking about is actually about ocean acidification. So B option will be incorrect in this case. Now, whereas in option C, it is talking about one of the phenomena that was mentioned in the fourth paragraph. However, sea temperature rising by 2 degrees Celsius is not something that has already happened, but something that we are anticipating that could happen in 2100. So a lot of people might have misunderstood the passage and thinking that it has already happened. And so option C will be still incorrect. Now we're going to be looking at what do you think is the intended message that the author is trying to express in reading the first paragraph, and how has the author supported his claim. And so we can see that in the first paragraph, they talk about the topic sentence and the thesis statement of the essay. It discussed the understanding of the European public and how climate change has affected the ocean. But we can also see that in the latter half of the first sentence, a lot of people are still misinformed or do not understand this topic. And hence, this particular text proposes that you need to change the way of communication, and thus you will attract people to make the right decisions and take the correct actions. And then in the latter half of the second paragraph, the author actually proposed a question. It's about how well do the public know about climate change and how to facilitate the communication between scientists, media, government, NGO, and the public. And so based on these questions, what kind of answer did the author give? And so that's how we know that poorly informed or misinformed citizens across Europe, as well as the failure at communicating climate change issue to the public, are the main ideas that the author is trying to convey in these texts. Furthermore, in paragraph 4 and 5, it further illustrated what kind of misconception do the public have. and how these misconceptions actually demonstrates the faults within their line of communication. For example, in a text, it actually demonstrated studies on how some of the perceived disaster that has not happened has already happened, and how scientists believe that this type of misinformation would actually prompt the general public to lose that drive to take precautionary measures. And in paragraph 5, we can see that it talked about how this is hugely disturbing and what kind of incentive do the citizens have to demand action to prevent these changes. Based from our discussions above, what can you infer from the passage? So you can see 4 different options on the screen. Choose the ones that apply. We can see that option 2 and 4 is messages that we can infer from the passage. Now, let's look at the conclusion of this text. It can be reasonably inferred from the conclusion that the survey calls for a greater involvement of university scientists because of what? Again, there are 4 different options. Pick the one that is most suitable. So the option that is most suitable will be option 4, where European scientists have more trust in university scientists. And hence, in the process of communication, more collaboration should be done with university professors. Now, let's go into reading 2. In reading 2, it talks about how we should take action against climate change through an ethical perspective. Now, this article is relatively longer, so we only took snippets of it from the original text. If you're interested, you can read the entire article online. Let's go. Happy reading. An excerpt from 3.3, Environmental Ethics, Climate Change by Jonathan Spellman. The problem of climate change. While abrupt climate change is definitely a problem, it is not necessarily a moral problem. Abrupt, anthropogenic, i.e. human-caused climate change, however, is a moral problem. To see this, consider the differences between a scenario in which a forest fire burns your neighbor's house down and a second scenario in which you burn your neighbor's house down. In the first scenario, when the forest fire burns your neighbor's house down, something bad has happened, but no one is morally responsible for that bad thing. No one has done anything morally wrong. In the second scenario, however, when you burn your neighbor's house down, not only has something bad happened, but someone is morally responsible for that bad thing. Is there abrupt anthropogenic climate change? Yes, there is. When human takes fossil fuel, for example, coal, oil, and natural gas, out of the ground and burn them to heat their homes, power their cars, and charge their electronics, they must emit greenhouse gases, most notable carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. The GHG particles absorb and emit radiant energy, which causes global warming, i.e. an increase in the Earth's average surface temperature, and other climate changes, for example, altered precipitation patterns that increase the number of extreme weather events. Although some people deny this, it is relatively uncontroversial. What is controversial, however, is the question of what you and I are morally required to do in response to about abrupt anthropogenic climate changes, hereafter simply climate change. Environmental ethicists generally agree that you and I are morally obligated to do something in response to climate change, but they disagree about what that is. In the following section, I'll argue that you and I are morally obligated to do 3 things in response to climate change. First, we must reduce our GHG emissions. Second, we must offset our remaining GHG emissions if we can afford to. And third, we must advocate for climate-friendly policies and politicians. Why? Because failing to do these things is irresponsible. Returning to the scenario in which you burn your neighbor's house down. In that scenario, you clearly harm to your neighbor. Even if you don't physically harm her, you destroy her property. You force her to find a new place to live. Climate change has similar effect. Between increasing the severity of droughts and flood and by causing sea level to rise, climate change is killing and will continue to kill humans and non-human animals. Others are being forced to abandon their home and find new places to live. For many humans, this will be much more difficult than simply finding a new home to buy. It will require abandoning one's homeland and moving somewhere completely foreign. For non-human animals, it will be even more difficult. Some species, like polar bears, for example, may find it impossible to adapt and will go extinct. Now, when you burn down your neighbor's house, you endanger your neighbor and force her to find a new place to live. This is clearly wrong. But when you contribute to climate change, do you endanger anyone? Do you force anyone to find a new place to live? It is not clear that you do. Notice that the harms of climate change are cumulative harms. Your contribution to the problem is relatively insignificant. This leads some to argue that when you contribute to climate change, you do not do anything morally wrong. While it may be true that your contribution to climate change is relatively insignificant, it is worth noting that how much you contribute to climate change varies significantly depending on where and how you live. Those living in Australia, Canada, and the United States, for example, emit much more carbon dioxide per capita than those living in India, Indonesia, and Brazil. This on its own may be a reason to think that you are doing something morally wrong, since you are contributing more than your fair share to climate change. Regardless, I want to argue that even if your contribution to the problem of climate change is relatively insignificant, it is still wrong. To see this, let's return to the hypothetical scenario we've been discussing. The scenario in which you burn your neighbor's house down. This time, however, let's assume that you don't actually burn your neighbor's house down. Instead, you created a trail of dry brush from a nearby forest to your neighbor's house. This on its own doesn't harm your neighbors in the least. It does, however, make it more likely that your neighbor's house will burn down. This is especially bad if there are frequent forest fires. But even if there aren't frequent forest fires, it is still morally wrong for you to endanger your neighbor and her home for no good reason. It is irresponsible. When we contribute to climate change, we do something analogous. We don't necessarily force anyone to find a new place to live, but we do increase the likelihood that people across the globe will have to find new places to live. This is morally wrong, especially when our reasons for contributing to climate change aren't good ones. If, for example, you start your car engine before getting into your car so that it has time to warm up, you're doing something morally wrong. Why? Because you're increasing the likelihood that human and non-human animals across the globe will have to find new places to live, and you're doing it for no good reason. Sure, it's nice to warm up your car before getting into it, but that isn't a sufficiently good reason to justify your endangering both human and non-human animals. Some reasons, however, are sufficiently good to justify your endangering both human and non-human animals. When it is very cold outside, for example, it is morally permissible to heat your home so that your pipes don't freeze. But when your salary doesn't permit you to live close to your workplace and you can't carpool or use public transportation to get there, it is morally permissible for you to drive to work. It's true that in driving, you will emit some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It is also true that this makes it slightly more likely that sentient beings will have to find new places to live, but you are not acting irresponsibly. Similarly, when you light a candle in your home, it increases the likelihood that your neighbor's house will burn down. But it doesn't follow from this that it is always wrong to light a candle in your home. Is this the full story? Not quite, and here's why. Imagine that you got a sufficiently good reason to light a candle. You realize that this increases the likelihood not only that your house will burn down, but also that your neighbor's house will burn down. Now imagine that there is some small things you could do to reduce the likelihood of your neighbor's house burning down. You could install a smoke alarm, for instance. It seems like you are morally obligated to do this. Note that you are not morally obligated to do this for your own sake. There's nothing necessarily wrong with burning yourself or destroying your house. I certainly don't recommend doing either of those things, but they are not necessarily morally wrong. The reason then that you are morally obligated to install a smoke alarm is not to protect yourself, but to protect your neighbor. If your candle were to start a fire, your smoke alarm would alert you to the danger, and you could call on the fire department to put out the fire before it destroys your neighbor's house. Failing to install a smoke alarm would be irresponsible. This becomes increasingly true as the number of people living close to you increases. If you're surrounded by homes, or if you live in an apartment and are surrounded by neighboring families with children and pets, lighting a candle without having a smoke alarm is especially irresponsible. When we contribute to climate change, we're doing something analogous. We're increasing the likelihood that humans and non-human animals will die or be forced to find new places to live. Fortunately, there's something we can do to reduce the likelihood of this. We could offset our GHG emissions, hereafter simply emissions. When we purchase carbon offsets, we fund projects that reduce emissions by funding the development of wind farms, enabling landfills to capture emissions, and/or preventing deforestation. When we offset enough of our emissions, we go carbon neutral, which is to say that our net emission, i.e., our emissions minus our offsets, equals zero. By offsetting our emissions, we make it the case that no human or non-human animal is more likely to die or lose her home on our account. When we offset our emissions, we act responsibly. This is what morality requires. Finally, imagine that you're living in an apartment and are surrounded by neighboring families. You light candles from time to time, but you have installed a smoke alarm and a sprinkler system. You do not significantly increase the likelihood that others will lose their homes. The same, however, cannot be said of your neighbors. They light candles all the time, but don't have smoke alarms or sprinkler systems. They're endangering all the people and non-human animals living in the apartment complex, but they don't see the problem. You would move to a new apartment complex, but let's assume that you are stuck in this one. It seems to me that in a case like this, a responsible person would not simply cross his finger and hope for the best. He would try to convince his neighbors to stop lighting candles all the time. He would encourage the manager of the apartment complex to add smoke alarms and sprinkler systems to every unit. He would petition the local governments to require these things in apartment buildings and vote for candidates who support these policies. He would advocate for change. Like we said previously, the article is not difficult, just a tad long. So now let's go directly to critical thinking skills. First, let's talk about individual responsibility. The author Spellman argues that unless you have a valid reason, or else when your action is actually affecting climate change, you are being morally irresponsible. So what I want you to think is the following. Number one, when do we have sufficiently good reason to perform these activities that could be morally damaging? And vice versa, when do we lack sufficient reasoning when we are performing these activities that are morally damaging? Are there good reasons at all? Next, in regards to individual responsibility, Spellman also talked about the importance of policies. Now, what I want you to think is what policies can you think of during our daily life that actually advocates for environmentally friendly or climate change friendly? When you're performing these tasks or activities, which one of these are actually morally obligated and which one of these are not? Now, let's try to combine what we've learned from these two readings together. The first reading talks about people's cognition and perception towards the concept of climate change. And the second article talks about our moral responsibility to climate change. The first one basically discusses the misinformation the public is receiving and how we should shift our focus from one to another, while the second one addresses the issue by focusing on changes using analogous ways or methods to compare our moral and non-moral responsibilities and actions. Next, we're going to listen to a speech by the Secretary General of the United Nations on how people globally can take action to fight against climate change. Having seen the video, let's see how do we synthesize these three different texts. Let's look at the screen. On the left-hand side, it's about reading 1, reading 2, as well as the video, all three of which share a common theme, including the motivation to address climate change, different types of climate change, as well as appeal for actions. Now, take a few moments, jot them down, and then we're going to come back and discuss. Good luck. Let's look at how well you have synthesized these different information. We can see on the screen that the motivation to address climate change is slightly different for each of the clips or the text. In reading 1, it discussed mostly about misconception about climate change and the need for better communication with the public. In reading 2, it talked about environmental ethics and obligations, while in the video clip, it talked about insufficient actions and escalated damages. So these are the motivations of why each different text aims to address climate change. Let's look at the type of climate change that it addressed in the different texts. In reading 1, it focused more on marine climate change, whereas in reading 2, it discussed more on abrupt anthropogenic climate change. In the video, it included all different kinds of climate change. Now for the third theme, appeal to action. In reading 1, it appeals more to reasoning, whereas in reading 2, it appeals to ethics and reason. And in the last video, which is the speech, it actually appeals to emotions. Essentially, different type of text and different form of text with their different aims actually all express different topics they want to argue for. Whichever one is more effective is the one you should be considering using in your future writing or in your future reading, or in your future critical thinking skills. Now, having understood the topic of climate change more this week, I hope you can now be able to synthesize this information into your daily life. Think about what action you could take to help fight against climate change. In this week, we also discussed how to differentiate facts from opinions, as well as integrated these different information into developing further of your critical reading skills. I hope today's lesson has been valuable to you. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.